Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Sorry, we were a few minutes late there. We're having some technical problems. Hopefully they work for us. We might, if the stream cuts out at all during this afternoon session, it just means that we're dealing with that, and we'll be able to restart it again in a minute or two. So bear with us. I think a lot of people are using the internet right now.
All right. Well, welcome to the second installment of Sandbox Sunday. We're thrilled to be coming at you another time here. I'm Johnny Allen, and together with Terry Sweeney, Ian Rosenbaum, Victor Cachese, we make up Sandbox Percussion. And we are thrilled to be joined by Chris Cerrone today. Chris Cerrone, for those of you who don't know, he's a fabulous composer. You can see him right there. Chris, you can go ahead and say hi.
Oh, I can say hi.
I'll allow it. Yeah. But yeah, Chris is he's won the Rome Prize, which I understand only 2 composers win each year, so that puts him in a pretty select group. He's been nominated for a Pulitzer. I've heard of that, and a Grammy. I've heard of that one too. And as if that's not enough, we actually are also feeling very lucky to call him a friend and a collaborator. And what we'll be talking about today, as if there's not enough information there already, is a piece that Chris is working on right now. Basically, as we speak, Chris is writing a new piece for us in collaboration with a pianist, Connor Hannon. I think we're calling it a concerto for...
Is it? It might be. It might be.
For prepared piano and percussion quartet, something like that.
It's a piece for prepared piano and percussion quartet, and with concerto-like features.
Yeah, exactly. And so Chris is being so generous with his time today to actually show us the innards of the piece and let us get a look behind the curtain at something that's actually being created, which I really love seeing. Something that didn't exist before kind of come into existence before our very eyes. And so just before we get into that, I wanted to mention that you, the viewers, we want to have you involved in this process as well. So if any questions come up or comments, feel free to post them to the right of the video there. There's a chat box. If you type things out, we'll take a peek at them and try and address as much as we can. And if your question floats off or something, but it still feels relevant, feel free to write it again. We'll try to keep up with it. Like Ian mentioned, there are some technical difficulties. Let us know if there's too much latency or something. We can always boot back up and we can get back into it. But without further ado, I feel like what better way to get to know a person than through their music. Maybe we'll play a little clip of a piece that Chris wrote for us a few years back. When was this? Gold Beaters again.
2017? Was it 2017? 2016? I can't remember. I think it premiered in 2017, right?
Sounds right. Yeah,
I think I wrote it throughout the fall of 2016.
Very nice. Yeah, and we have many fond memories learning it, performing it, and eventually recording it. So we'll play just a little snippet of it to give you a sense for Chris's music and the collaboration we've already had.
And it features the luminous voice of Elspeth Davis, who is a mezzo-soprano, who is... in addition to being an amazing singer, Ian's wife. And so we had a really good time collaborating with her very regularly, and she was really wonderful to work with as well.
For sure. And I actually am experiencing some latency here internally. Forgot that we're actually not going to play things live because then we are going to crash the whole system. So we'll paste the link. Does that seem like a good solution?
Yeah, we'll paste the link in the chat. It's about 20 minutes long. It's in 7 movements. And just to describe it briefly, each piece I try to write for percussion tries to expand on the works I write for percussion, and also just thinking about each new piece is what can a percussionist do? Because I usually think a percussionist is someone who can do whatever I tell them to do for the most part. So in my first piece for percussion performed before this really was this piece called Memory Palace that Ian has played many times as a solo. And that has little snippets of guitar in it. And so I was like, well, there's little snippets of guitar in this piece, so then there'll be a lot of guitar in this piece now. So Johnny and Victor both got pretty freaking good at playing guitar for this piece, and that was one of the expansions. And then there's a whole host of different instruments that are sort of found instruments, like wood slats that are actually tuned, and metal pipes that are tuned, and I'm told some of the hardest sand block music in the repertoire.
That's right.
That's right, really testing out.
Sand block pocketing.
Yeah, so if you've got the link, you can feel free to just put that on in the background. That could be the background track to this whole chat if you want. You mentioned that Memory Palace piece that you collaborated with Ian a bit. I think before we start talking about the specific piece, it'd be great to get a little background on you and on the collaborations. I think the longest relationship any of us have had with you would be Ian, right? You guys were at school together?
Yep, and we used to, drink beers on the porch after concerts and hang out quite a lot. And then it turned out he was a really good player too, which is a funny thing that happens when you go to school where Bob Van Sice teaches, so you get all these amazing percussionists come through the program. So yeah, that was the first piece I wrote, and Ian was part of a consortium of percussionists that commissioned that piece. And sort of the principle of that piece was that since no one necessarily owned the same instruments, that it would be scored for this barrage of found instruments. So that was my first time writing for these wooden slats that I now have 3 pieces that feature them. It features an old guitar, it features blowing into beer bottles, which this new piece also has that. So it's kind of like, I think I developed an arsenal of sounds in my music that, continue. And really what I think is really, the thing to me was like, at that point I was writing an opera. I wasn't thinking of myself as a percussion guy. I was like, oh, that's niche. And, and I think that the writing of that piece and then several subsequent pieces after came to understand how central percussion instruments were to my entire way of thinking about instruments and my entire way of thinking about attack and sustain and resonance. And so that whole piece was sort of a lot about that. And my work continues to be extremely informed by percussion writing in general. And I'd say that this new piece is a continuation of all those things. But I think maybe just we grow up with so much music that is really reliant upon attack in general. So like I grew up playing piano, I grew up listening to pop music and jazz that has a lot of drums and piano and other things in it. And I think just making music with that, and then you have this orchestra where there's 80 violins and 1 percussionist, and I think that balance never quite feels intuitively right to me. So I always want to have a lot of percussion and add a lot of percussionists to everything I do.
Yeah, and there's something really kind of almost merciful in a way of the way you wrote Memory Palace, where instead of writing for a marimba and a vibraphone and 12 tom-toms, and now already the budget for a percussionist to play that piece is almost $20,000.
Mm-hmm.
But for these found instruments that anyone could just build this setup for, under $1,000.
I think $200. I mean, except for a couple of odds and ends here and there, but I think because Ian and I did the wood together, I think we spent $100 on wood at Home Depot, and then convinced a friend to use his bandsaw and cut the ends of those. And, beer. I've never had a percussionist complain about having to procure empty beer bottles. I always do wonder about someone being an alcoholic and, not wanting to trigger them in some way. I know that the percussionist at Peabody was using, what was the one, Nanoko? Is that her name again?
Nanoka, yeah.
Yeah. She was, I noticed it was really cute because she was using Coke bottles.
It doesn't have to be alcoholic, and any kind of bottle will work. It's fine.
It's true, but I do feel the dominant mode is beer bottles and whiskey bottles.
Yes.
So yeah, I think it's that Cajun idea of for me, I think it's this way of opening up the larger world into the concert hall, and to also bring sort of natural. I'm very interested in sort of imperfection in music. I'm interested in imperfect sounds, and I think a lot of these found sounds are ways to build imperfect things into more perfect sounds, like a violin or a clarinet, which are these kind of beautiful, perfect instruments that play perfectly in tune, and then it's try getting your beer bottle perfectly in tune. It's not possible.
That's really great. And I do kind of wonder, when you go about writing a piece like that, I mean, these are new sounds for you as well. I mean, what's the discovery process? I mean, do you feel like they kind of feed you ideas as you're writing, or do you have the ideas and then put them on the instruments?
No, I definitely just like, I think listening is a huge part of composing, and I think a part of composing, the thing, composers really don't do enough sometimes, is to hear what's sort of latent within the sound. And I think that for me, yeah, like so much of it is just, I mean, the sort of second movement of this piece that I'll show you guys a little bit of is that I was just listening to this bowed piano sound, and I was listening to the overtones of the bowed piano. So you hear the low E flat that I'll play, but then you really hear this like G right way above it, this overtone G. It's very strong in the sound, and so naturally my ear just went there, and so I'm like, okay, well that note will be G, and there'll be a. So I think it's really about, because I think so much of my work deals with resonance, and how does resonance operate, and how does resonance operate as a way of evoking memory. You know what I mean? Like, to me, like resonance, reverberation, they're all this kind of like, it's like a sound, how it exists in time is like a lot about like how memory exists in our lives. It's like sort of have the same kind of reverb tail, and they change as they decay. So I think when I compose, there's a lot of it is really about listening, and also I think exploiting natural imperfections. Like, you'll see a lot of natural imperfections in this new piece.
That's such a beautiful description. I've never thought of resonance that way. I really like that.
Well, you don't win the Rome Prize by, I'm kidding. Not being able to sufficiently BS your way through a description of your work.
And so, did you always think you were going to be a composer? I always wonder, like, was there anything else that crossed your mind at any point, or was it just like gung-ho going for it all?
I think it was sort of the moment I figured it out. It was quite clear to me. I was always a musician. I played, piano since I was a kid, and then I played jazz as well. I played jazz piano, and then I decided at some point I was going to become a composer. And I also played guitar, which is probably why guitar found its way into so many Memory Palace and other related pieces. And then at some point, just like randomly out of the blue, I think I really became obsessed with the idea of being a classical musician, becoming a composer. And I think it was just this idea of wanting to build longer time forms. And I mean, not that this doesn't exist in other forms, but just being able to manipulate instruments and notate and think about, like, large forces of instruments, large time spans, and that, because I love pop music and I always will, and I think it's basically best form is like a 3-minute thing, and it's this kind of crystalline, amazing thing. I mean, there's exceptions, don't get me wrong, but that is the joy of a pop song. It's also the joy of a Schubert lieder. But, I think at some point when I was like 17, I decided very hardcore to become a composer. I had a couple of really wonderful music teachers, a music theory teacher, and also there was the head of our department was a bassist, and I played electric bass, but I didn't know how to play double bass, and he agreed one summer to give me a month of 2 months of daily free lessons if I taught piano in his music program. So I did, and the next year I joined the orchestra, and so I played in an orchestra for the first time as a double bass player. And I had, the opportunity to kind of build my skills from there. And then, at that point, I was all in.
Did you play guitar in any '90s punk bands?
Oh, there's like a series of really embarrassing tapes from middle school. I was in like kind of screaming metal band that then became a glam metal band, which was weird.
Okay.
It was really, I have to say that like that band was this kind of beautiful expression of our drummers gradually coming out of the closet, and it got glamour, and there was more makeup, and I'm like, oh, okay, I see what journey you're on right now. And then I think in middle school, or high school rather, I played in like some emo and punk bands. And yeah, there are embarrassing tapes that are mostly hidden away, but certain people have it.
And did you start getting lessons on composition at age 17, or that's just when you were like?
My family who are amazing, really just didn't even know the composition lessons existed. I didn't really know that they existed. I knew I wanted to go to school for it, so I think I found some guy on Long Island who taught me a couple of lessons who clearly wasn't really happening. And then, so it really wasn't, I wound up at NYU sort of as a hedging against going hardcore into music. My parents, really wanted me to go to university. And so I did actually have a wonderful teacher there in composition named Ruth Shuntal, who passed away. But she was great and really encouraging, and she encouraged me actually to then go to conservatory. So I wound up at MSM a couple of years later, having some really great teachers, and then finally at Yale, where I intersected with basically everyone in this world.
Yeah, I just love hearing this story. It's so interesting that I think for so many of us we could draw kind of we could draw back to a moment where we kind of decided we wanted to be a musician. I think so much of that moment actually relies on the generosity of someone else, like this teacher who said, I'll give you a month of free lessons, like that. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And I think probably all five of us have maybe a similar moment, where a teacher was just like way more generous than they needed to be. And that actually ends up being this kind of turning point, which is sort of fascinating. Really quickly, I think we're getting a question here, a little more about that moment, Chris, where you felt like you were a classical composer, and then you kind of became your self-titled percussion composer. Just a little bit about that transition, if that was how different are those two things, or is that a seamless transition for you?
I think it was pretty seamless, because it's funny, I was working on the scoring of my opera Invisible Cities, and the scoring of that is already really unbalanced compared to a classical ensemble. There's 2 pianos, harp, percussion, and then 3 strings and 2 winds and 2 brass. And so you can already see that there was a real strong push towards sort of struck sounds, sustained sounds, and I just hadn't explored as deeply as really I was ready to. I mean, I think my relationship with a lot of instruments has to do with writing a solo piece for them. So, I wrote Memory Palace, and then, these other percussion pieces, and I became really intimate with percussion, to the point now where, like, with a lot of, my orchestral works, I get so detailed on things and talking to, what mallets are you using? I've tried using mallet models, but, you really get in there with the percussionists. And I remember, like, I was having a rehearsal with the Detroit Symphony, and there was an Almglocken and in the piece, and I stopped the rehearsal of the violin concerto, and I'm like, someone is playing an octave too high, I can't tell who it is. And finally we figured out it was the Almglocken player who was playing an A an octave too high, and he's like, what, I thought it was the same thing. And I'm like, no, it's not. So so I think they're just getting into, like, once I know an instrument, it's the same thing with a flute. Actually, I wrote a flute piece for Tim Monroe, fabulous flute player based in Chicago, and for flute and electronics. And when I wrote that piece, I bought a flute. I started learning how to play it. Same way I have learned to play a lot of percussion things. And I think that just that personal hands-on relationship with that instrument has caused me to be so much more idiomatic and reliant on that instrument in my writing. So I think every time I write for something or other, I wind up getting really deep on it, and that is sort of percussion that just happened. And then as the nature of percussionists being kind of uniquely omnivorous for new repertoire, they got, first of all, Memories of Palace started getting played all the time, which is wonderful. And then I started asking for more pieces. And so the more you do, the more you get into it, the more people you work with. And so it's kind of this self-prophesized hole that I'm now in, of course, where I have said that, like, after this one, no more, because I've written now Percussion Quartet Concerto, piece for Percussion Quartet Electronics, which became a solo, and then a Goldbeater for percussion quartet and voice. And so I'm like, at this point, I'm like, that's enough. Like, at least for a while. I have to write Ian a percussion concerto as well one day. That's also on the... Has
to. Well, no, Chris, I mean, what you just said was so interesting. And last week we had a conversation that was more generally about writing for these percussion instruments. So how do you deal with because when I think about your percussion output, one of the things I think about is you inventing new instruments and coming up with new ways to play instruments that people haven't thought of before. So how, as someone who is not a percussionist at all, like you weren't trained in that at all, how do you go about discovering those things when you might not have access to the instruments, when you don't have the technical ability that your performers are going to need to have to play all of that stuff?
I mean, a lot of it is, like, hanging out with you guys, seriously. Like, I mean, like, every piece we've worked on, we've had a lot of workshops. And then, and same thing with the piano part of this piece. Connor and I met up at Juilliard, where he teaches, a few weeks ago, and back when one could go outside, it was glorious. Never been so sentimental for a February in New York City. But and showed me all these things, and he, the same thing is, you guys like show me 25 things, and then I latch on to one of them.
Right.
And then so that I think that maybe the nice thing about percussion is, like, there is the bar of entry is, in a sense, very low to do percussion badly. You know what I mean? Like, right. Same thing with piano. It's like anyone can play, like, piano very badly. Anyone can play percussion very badly. So then there is this sense of, like, it's hard for me to, like, play oboe badly. I don't know how to do anything with the oboe, but I can, like, hit something, or I can strike something, or I can play a beer bottle, and then you guys sort of have the same tendency to sort of, you know, anything I can sort of do, you can do a little bit more gracefully, or you know, or do three things at the same time when I can do one. And so I think that the bar for entry for what percussion is feels very low, and it also sort of connects, I think, more to my whole childhood of like playing in rock bands, like recording stuff. It's just, you know, it's much more connected to that than say, you know, like the oboe, which I'm not meaning to denigrate. I love the oboe; it's a beautiful instrument. Um, it's sort of the most perfect one thing instrument. It does this one thing incredibly well, and percussion sort of does everything, and that's sort of, I say, the difference.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I don't want to like what you just said about all the workshops that we all do together when we play pieces. I mean, I wanted to just like to tell an anecdote. Like, Chris and I are close. We talk all the time. We're friends. But I feel like the majority of the text messages that Chris sends me are like very specific percussion related questions. Like, if you use a rubber mallet on this wood block, will you be able to hear it over these 12 other instruments in an orchestra? And he's always focused on these tiny little details about how he can better notate and better think about the percussion related things that he's doing. And so I kind of feel like it takes this all-encompassing kind of thought process where you're not leaving anything to chance. You're considering every little detail of how things could be notated or could be written to help set the performer up for success.
Well, yeah, and then like half the time the player still blows you off. They at least know your intentions.
Like
no,
with the Almglocken.
Well, you know, but I actually was revising the same violin concerto the other day, and I found a note in the percussion part saying, "Please use brand new sandpaper for your sandpaper block to increase the volume." And
That's
I'm like,
important.
I know, and you know, some orchestral guy who's like, you know, not in contemporary rap, and you know, maybe he's more used to playing the triangle than the sand block is. You know, it's used. You know, I just think it gives them an idea, if nothing else. And
yeah.
So,
it reminds me, I mean, this is not the same thing at all, but it reminds me of the Bartok Sonata score. So the Bartok Sonata is one of the original percussion chamber music pieces. It's one of the oldest, first pieces to use percussion in a big way. And there's a note, like a performance note from Bartok saying that the pianists should take special care to watch over the percussionist and make sure they're playing the right notes and the right rhythms with the right mallets. Wow. I feel like we've come a little bit since then.
Through the rehearsal.
Right.
That's so funny. That's so funny. I love that. Like, just check on them.
Yeah.
They're not really musicians yet.
Yeah, we've come a long way.
Yeah. Well, I will say one of the other major formative experiences I forgot to mention about percussion was that I had this random job over the summer when I was at MSM cleaning all the percussion instruments one summer, and it was actually a really fun job because I just got to know every percussion instrument really, really well, and that was And then when I was there, we also had Steve Schick on faculty, and they performed Ionization by Perez, a super famous percussion piece, and they didn't have enough percussionists at the school, so they asked me to sit in working with Steve on an unconducted performance of Ionization that we rehearsed for like 6 months. It was such a great experience, and so I think it just, you know, made me think the percussionists are cool, and made me think that piece was cool, and it also was, you know, one of my first real experiences performing. And so, yeah, it was a rare and awesome thing to do.
That's an amazing experience. That's really cool.
Yeah, he's magical.
I had one question that I was kind of reminded of when you were talking about the way instruments can kind of tell you what to write. You were talking about that, you know, the bowed piano or I guess rubbed strings, but I heard you say at one point that also the ensemble you're writing for, the people you're writing for, you kind of think about what that has an influence on what you write as well. Whether
Absolutely.
Yeah, and do you feel like you're doing that with this piece that you're working on now, or yeah?
I do. It's always like a weird moving target because you don't want to you have this idea of a group and then they surprise you. So it's like not. I mean, I would say in that like I trust Sandbox to figure it out is like kind of my main thing. I'm like definitely not going. I'm not being. There are probably groups I would be more conservative. That's what I'd say. I mean, or like you have this like I remember I will not name any names, but I wrote a piece for a very well known group, and I was like, oh, this is totally the right piece for them, and then they just did not like playing it, and it was very clear that they didn't like playing it because I thought I had like targeted, like I thought I clocked what they were good at, and I was so wrong.
I mean, does that have something to do with the fact that you have like we talk a lot about how we enjoy these these partnerships with composers that stretch over multiple pieces. You know, like
Mhm.
even if your best friend writes you a piece, the first time that you work together in a professional setting, you don't always get it exactly right. And so, does it have anything to do with that? Like, you and I have now done many projects, but with the rest of the Sandbox guys at this point, they've all been involved in a bunch of different things with you.
Yeah, I feel very. I don't know. I'd say that I just feel like I'm totally not worrying. I'd say that would be my thing. I mean, I know Connor. I know his kind of musicality, and I would just say that I trust you guys to figure it out. So like I'd say that like composers definitely modulate how careful they are in the composing process, and now I'm just like trying to do exactly what I want to do musically. But I think I am thinking. I think a lot about the visual. Like I'll show you the third movement of this piece, and it's super percussion-y, and I'm like imagining you guys having a really good time playing it. And so like you do envision like the people and knowing them and the pleasures they take, and like I think that they're you do want to like you want to not write the percussion piece with no fun percussion parts. Like you want to it's really enjoyable to write pieces that are enjoyable to play as well. And so I think about that a lot too. And I know you guys, I know your tastes, I know the music you like, I know the music you program and play. And so
what are Sandbox weaknesses, Chris?
Sorry,
I don't mean to cut you off.
I'd say you don't have any weaknesses, but I would say that I think you guys like to do lyrical playing and you like to do rhythmic playing. And so I wanted to include both of those in this piece. And that's what I would say.
Gosh, I'm just like goosebumps now. I really just want to hear the piece. Do you think it's cool if we just like dive in?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
We do have a question actually in the chat.
Oh, great. Yeah, let's do it.
It's actually about Goldbeater Skin. Maybe we can talk a bit about that and then dive into the examples.
With Gold a little longer.
Yeah. Can you guys talk about Goldbeater Skin a little bit? Hoping to perform it next year, and this seems like the perfect time to get some insight. We were talking a little bit about Goldbeater Skin earlier. Actually, I think we pasted a link to a video in the chat. It might be up there. Maybe we can paste it in there again, so it's a little more current in the chat. But yeah, I mean, Goldbeater Skin is. We talked a bit about it earlier, but I think that one of the things that we're talking about now with Chris is we love that a lot of his music is very lyrical for percussion, and that is, I think it's a really unique voice in the percussion world. So obviously there's lots of different logistical things to figure out with Goldbeater Skin, with the guitars and the sandpaper blocks and the almond block and pipes and all these instruments that are coming together.
It was my idea of having a small setup, so I just want
to... The idea was to write kind of a partner piece to the Ligeti, right? Originally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which has the world's largest setup.
Right. So we were thinking like, maybe you could write for like some of the same instruments. We could like put them on the same program. I think there's not too many of the same instruments, but we have done it on both pieces on the same program before, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. As did Third Coast, who co-commissioned the piece.
Right.
Yeah, I think you both have done it, and that's a real university or someone with a great big budget concert, because if it's a university, you could just pull them out of their collection, or it's someone who doesn't mind renting, $3,000 worth of instruments, which is mostly Ligeti's fault and not mine.
Yeah, when I think to watch the video we posted, it's that'll get you to like what we kind of dreamed the piece would sound like for sure.
Yeah, and there's actually, and someone should paste this into the notes, I deliberately uploaded a video of your performance from Trinity Wall Street in New York, which is I think a great performance, but I think it's not as utopian. There wasn't thousands of edits, so you can see what it's like to do it live, and that's one of I really wanted to put that online for that very reason, so the group's doing it. I would say if I think that it's been really cool to see this piece done several times, and I actually wound up making a version of the piece also for soprano and quartet, which it's exactly the same piece. It's just up a whole step. But it sort of broadened the possibilities of the group. And I've seen a bunch of student musicians do it, and it's a really awesome, we did it at Baylor University last year, and that was a really great opportunity to see students, they stretch themselves, and it was great. But I'm not sure I have any Maybe you guys have better advice about how to play it. I would say if I have any advice, it's like just it's a piece where you have to kind of just keep going and not get lost in the moment or something.
Yeah, well, I found that most of our conversation was about less about rhythmic lining stuff up. Like all that, I think works. We could sing through the piece on day one, but the conversation became a lot more about the intention behind the phrases and how are we going to place that note and what is that in relation to the notes around it and we're creating this singular sound between the four of us, like it's maybe a crocale, a vibraphone, and an omblock, and we want it to sound like so calm profound. Like it's just its own thing. And how do we balance and voice ourselves to create that sound that you had in your ear? So that was really the challenge inside of it.
I think that's true. Like for us, one of the hardest things to do was figuring out how to create like one long melody among all four of us. Like there's lots of moments where you play one note, someone plays the next note, someone plays the next, and I'm not talking about rhythmically making that a difficult thing, but as if one singer was singing that entire line.
Yeah, and that was a comment I remember from a friend of the stream, Timo Andres, pianist, composer, is that he's like, oh, this is just like four people playing a piano piece. You know what I mean? Like, so I think that's quite hard actually to breathe as an ensemble, and I think that was something you guys did exceedingly well.
Well, I think one of the reasons why we keep coming back to your work is that a lot of composers challenge us with respect to that, but rhythmically in terms of verticality, and that's the thing that all percussionists need to get good at. But you really challenge us horizontally with that same sort of thing.
I do think that you sort of young percussionists are like really good at kind of hammering out the rhythms. I mean, it's sort of the opposite of a violinist or where they're really good at melodies and notes and thinking about phrase, and then you're like, okay, 1, 2, 3, play evenly. And then I think percussion is because there's so much of their early training is just drilling in rhythms. They're really strong at rhythms, but then like, okay, we need to go from rhythms to music, and that's what I hope to challenge percussionists to do in my music.
I love in Goldbeater Skin that we're challenged very much so to do both and switch gears very, very quickly. I mean, going from Goldbeater Skin 5th movement to 6th movement to 7th movement.
Yeah, totally. And I think
completely different skills. And
yeah, I mean, I think some people have commented that it's rarely like a single moment in my music that is actually very hard. It's rather the kind of collective amount of skills required to do the things is that you are asked to do everything you can do, basically.
Yeah. In that sense, I feel like it's difficult in a similar way to the way the Ligeti is difficult.
Definitely.
The Ligeti piece is like 13 minutes long. It's 7 movements, and some of the movements are like 1 minute and 35 seconds long. But it's like 1 minute and 35 seconds of that was 6 months of practice for me to get that 1 minute and 35 seconds accurate.
And logistics too, I think, is a big part of both things, because the danger of that Ligeti piece is that each movement is about 1 minute long and it's for a different setup. So it can be a 13-minute piece that takes 25 minutes to perform if it's not performed carefully.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I'm really glad you did post the video from Trinity, and I think anyone who's performing it, they should definitely check that one out just to see kind of how we navigate the logistics.
Absolutely.
That's really helpful.
Yeah, that was the very reason I wanted to share that, because it's like, okay, in the ideal circumstance, this is perfect, but, in the real circumstance, this is a great guide to how to play it.
Well, should we pivot to the new piece?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I mean, before we even get it, because I know Chris has all kinds of awesome content to show us about what's in the new piece, but could we talk about what the piece is, how the commissioning process for the piece happened, where we're hoping to play it, all that kind of stuff. So Chris, like, whose idea was this new piece?
I think this started with Connor, probably in 2012, asking me for piano concerto. And, basically I was just continually being in conversation about it. And I think kind of semi-recently he got very serious about it. And, so we started talking about it more and more. And then sort of as this started to come to fruition, I actually wound up having another piano concerto commission from an amazing pianist named Shai Wasner that I wrote last year. And so this was coming to the same season, and I was like, well, Connor, like, I don't want to just write 2 piano concertos. That seems like a service to nobody. And he was like, well, yeah, that makes sense. And then he sort of came back to me, because I know Connor plays with Johnny in Amok, right? And so that American, I don't know what it stands for, a muck ensemble. And so, he was like, oh, why don't we do something with Sandbox? I'm like, well, I'm always game to do something with Sandbox. So that was sort of where, and then my other thought was like, okay, if I'm going to write this piece with a heavy solo part, right next to another piece with a heavy solo part, I want to differentiate them again further somewhere. And I know Connor is so great at all this prepared piano stuff, to the point where he's literally like professor of prepared piano at Juilliard. He teaches a class in preparing piano. So I'm like, well, this is so one of his great strengths, in addition to just being a really good musician. So that was it was born from that idea. And then we were really, really lucky to have Jay and Helen Schlichting provide a lot of the commissioning support for the project, which was really, really generous of them, and great supporters of my work, who also incidentally commissioned Goldbeater Skin. So they are single-handedly expanding the percussion repertoire. And then and now Kara Moore was so awesome to present the premiere. And I think, are we allowed to say what the next one will be, or is that still?
That one's still a little under wraps for right now.
All right,
I think.
There'll be more performances of the piece after that. So that was sort of, that's kind of it really sort of once the ball was rolling, it was a really smooth process, and it's really becoming so much its own thing that I'm no longer even concerned about Piano Concerto 1 versus Piano Concerto. They're such different babies and worlds, and but yeah, I think it was a way. The prepared piano thing was also a way for, obviously, like, to blend the worlds of piano and percussion. Like I think it's funny because I'll show you two movements of the piece. One is basically one where there's no attacks for the most part in an ensemble that's all attack. So it's all bowed and very little struck. And then the other movement is basically I make the piano into a percussion instrument by muting all the pitches. And there'll be another movement which doesn't exist yet. But so I think that was kind of the idea of finding these different ways to blend these worlds quite a lot. And I think you won't be able to see this today, but I think a big part of the piece will be, for example, the pianist starting some kind of extended technique thing and then handing that thing off to a percussionist, also playing inside the piano, and then Connor will sit down and play, more traditionally.
Well, so Chris, take us through the process. Like, how do you write a piece like this when you don't have a percussion quartet, you don't have Connor there? How do you start to write it?
Well, I think I started just by meeting up with everyone and recording tons of sounds. So, like, I really collected techniques and also things that are interesting that I might not know about. I'm sort of, I obviously know the basics at this point with percussion, but, I think something that this piece will probably wind up using a lot of is sort of thinking about if the prepared piano is like a junky piano somehow, then I wanted to use junky things in percussion as well. And so that was, a big thing for me is to, and I actually don't know if that's happening at this point, but there are definitely some junky instruments. This is going to play a really big part in the piece. It's a harmonica that I bought for $10 off of Amazon, and so you'll all play lots of this. And that gets doubled with bowed vibes. And then my other favorite standby is the Sandbox, which will play quite prominently in this piece as well. And did you want me to show you that little video I made of just some of the preparations that I discovered working with Connor for the piece?
That would be great. Let's give it a shot. Latency issues be damned.
Let's see. Is it working? Is it going to work?
I think we've been okay. People can tell us in the chat, but it looks okay on my end.
All right, let's give it let's give it a shot. It's because you're standing close to the router, I think. Okay. Okay, so this is just a little video I made yesterday, just showing off a couple of the preparations in the composition. And tell me, so here we flash back into time to yesterday, and you can hear just a couple of the sounds I'm using quite a lot in this piece. So here is a quick introduction to a few of the sounds I use in this piece that are prepared in the piano. We really mostly use Lutac, which is just kind of a cheap available putty that is available in any hardware store, and I use it on the higher end of the piano to make this very high muted sound, which then sounds very different with the pedal down. And then the middle of the piano actually has putty just on one of the 3 strings, which detunes it slightly. And then the lowest end of the piano has just a ton of putty on it, as you can see in this image, where I guess it's thud. Which again, if you add a piano, sounds, with a pedal rather, it sounds quite good. So that's some of the main sounds that will exist in the piece.
So cool. Wow.
And so yeah, a big way I work as a composer more and more over these years is really just to build in a program called Logic, which is just a digital audio workstation. It's the same as Pro Tools or whatever. A whole piece out of these sounds. The other sound in this piece that I don't have a document of, but I have made recordings of, is a bowed piano, which is in this you use again more cheap stuff from the hardware store, fishing tackle, and you create a kind of strand of it, and you draw it over a string after rubbing violin rosin on it, and it creates an incredible sound. I can show sort of if I can do another screen share and it all continues to work.
You like weave it underneath the string?
Exactly. You kind of create, you draw it up like this over the piano. So it's woven in between the string. And there's an amazing group called the Bowed Piano Ensemble, which really, they have like 10 or 12 people doing it. But I'll play just a discrete sound, which is really the basis of this entire movement. But here we're in Logic, and so you can hear this is just the bowed piano by itself. And it has this kind of amazing resonance to it that really suggested a lot of this entire movement. Which should I play it? Should I talk over it? How should I do this? I can kind of just talk through some of the technical ways of writing. Is that one thing I do is I build what is called samplers. So it's like it's like a keyboard basically, but it has all my custom notes on it. So it's like here's like my keyboard that plays harmonics on a piano, and here's my keyboard. Here's my my high notes. Let's see if this works. Now the second you try to, here we go. And that's that technique I just showed you on my piano at home. And so yeah, and basically I built this collection of all these sounds you guys played me. Another big one is bowed vibes with snare.
So that's like just putting the snare drum near the vibraphone while we're playing it, right?
Yep, and so I'm basically able to access all these sounds pretty quickly. And so that's a real way, because I think it's a lot, you use traditional playback and it's like, okay, and it sounds horrible. And so for me, working this way really gets close, and as you can see, I build sort of the tempo and the time signature changes and all that stuff. And yeah, so that's one of the big sounds in the movement. Another big sound is blown bottles. This is all, will wind up being a whole step higher, but you can hear this is whiskey bottles that I've been slowly emptying over the course of the quarantine. Let's see, is this it? No, I'm sorry, this is it. And then you've got the harmonica sounds. Something I really wanted to exploit in this piece was natural imperfections of instruments. So something I noticed is that my cheap $10 harmonica from the internet is really out of tune. And it's just sort of the nature of harmonicas. So you'll hear, something I took advantage of is like you'll hear a harmonica. And that's quite out of tune with, oops, I can't keep track. That's a bowed vibraphone and a harmonica in unison. So that's a big part of this piece, is exploiting these natural imperfections of the instrument. And then, so once this kind of microtone idea got in my head, that another thing that became a huge part of this was using that piano sound I showed you before, where the strings get detuned. And something that's rather ingenious. It actually came from a piece by Eric Webbles, who's a composer I admire a lot. Where there's a lot of things that people don't like to do to pianos, especially nice pianos, and there sort of seems to be this worldwide consensus that this putty, that blue tack is actually quite harmless and can be done on most pianos without anyone getting too mad, as opposed to putting pieces of metal on strings really seems to cause a lot of consternation for technicians. And so a big goal in this piece was to use preparations that are not as problematic.
It also seems like it's not too time consuming. I've watched Connor Hannick prepare the John Cage setup, and he needs like 2 hours or maybe an hour and a half to get it just right.
He should be able to do this in 10 minutes, maximum 10 minutes. Wow. Yeah.
Amazing.
That's such it's a tiny example, but that's such an amazing example of setting this piece up for success, because it's like a 20-25 minute piece, so there's going to be all kinds of other pieces on the program. Connor might need a piano that doesn't have those preparations for other pieces on the program, and so just thinking about that during the writing process, it just means that we're going to be able to play it more, which is amazing.
Oh, absolutely, and this really was, and I haven't quite figured it out yet, and he may wind up doing things in the middle of the piece too, and preparing and unpreparing things. It might not be, but it's really simple. It'll there's 3 notes that are bowed. That's probably the most time consuming, and then other than that, it's just this putty. It's probably 10 minutes.
That's good to know. Ironically, Chris, I think the piece that I stress out about the most to set up for concerts is actually Gold Leader Skin. There's just so many little things to remember,
We'll see what happens with this one.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ins and outs in this one. You're gonna have to all wear those harmonica things that Bob Dylan wears over his head.
Oh, right.
Because your 2 hands are gonna be busy doing other things.
Right.
Should I play a little bit of this? It's about 5.5 minutes long.
Yeah. Well, so this is like a whole draft of what one part of the piece is going to look like.
This is what the second movement of the piece will basically sound like.
Is it 5 minutes?
It's 5 minutes and like 30 seconds, yeah.
Great. And the whole movement will be 5 minutes, or the whole movement is going to be longer?
No, this is the whole movement.
Awesome.
And I saw also that we have Kathy tuning in right now. She was just writing in the chat. I don't know if we mentioned, but the piece is supposed to premiere, I think you mentioned this, Johnny, at Caramore, June 25th, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I've been counting that.
Yes, we're all praying to Anthony Fauci that if that happens.
Fingers crossed, yeah.
Well, yeah, Chris, let's play a couple minutes of this. So this is the first time that any of us have heard it too, so we're really excited.
So this is the second movement, quite lyrical, quite slow, and the last one's very rhythmic. So yeah, I have a bunch of it, and you just stop me when you feel like it's boring. And I can talk over it a bit too.
Yeah, maybe mention something.
So this is for piano and Sandbox and brushes on drums right now. And scraped cymbals as well. Kind of scrape with the piano. Both vibes. Now both vibes and beer bottles that naturally are in tune with one another. The first harmonica. First entrance of the piano. It's sneaking in. This is the tremolos in the detuned piano. out-of-tune piano is doubled with Glocken, which are also kind of out-of-tune sounding, and the really high muted sound I played before. You can hear bowed vibraphone with the snare drum really close to creating that hiss sound. Very high crotales, very high piano, very high glockenspiel altogether. And the very end of this movement features a technique that Sandbox taught me where a crotale gets placed exactly on top of a snare drum head. You know, at the very end. It creates an amazing sound right here. And so this is the end of the movement, and this is just a little transition featuring the same Sandbox from before, but they become rhythmic. And you'll hear how this is just a quick build into the last movement, which I'll show you after this, which is quite rhythmic and exciting. So I needed to figure out a way to get from slow, sustained, and little by little. And we'll go straight into the next movement, which is a fast movement.
Wow.
Sounds amazing, Chris.
So
Thanks,
cool,
guys.
man.
Wow. Can I ask a really maybe obvious question, just preliminarily?
No, go for it.
So like it's clear you're putting the sounds or the samples you made when you came to the studio and recorded all these instruments. You're putting them together in Logic.
Mm-hmm.
Is this your normal way of composing? Do you always start in Logic, or do you sometimes start in Sibelius? Or
Well, it's funny. The next movement I'll show you is actually started in Sibelius, run into Logic, which is my other way of working. These two ways have become quite clear to me, my ways of working, and that I really, there must be composers who actually hear all the sounds in their head and it comes to them, although I don't actually fully believe it. But, this kind of idea of a composer who hears it and then it happens. Whereas I think for me, I listen to the sounds, and so kind of dragging them around like this is kind of my natural way of working. But so yeah, I mean, obviously, I think I listened to that sound, I heard that wow, and then I heard that kind of high G literally ringing out as an overtone, which you hear later with the low note and stuff. And so I think that was at the beginning of it. I heard the natural resonance of the sound, and so I built music listening to the sounds.
Yeah.
I've always thought this about your music, but it's just so evocative. Like, I experience, like, pretty intense, like, visceral emotions when I'm listening to it. And I wonder, like, are you driven by that in any way? Like, are you going for, like, a feeling or an emotion in a way? Or is it really more just about the sounds?
Well, I think this movement's actually going to be called The Great Empty, which was there was this New York Times article from a couple of weeks ago that while I was writing this, I kept staring at, which is all these photographs of these, big urban centers that were really just empty. The Times Square empty, center of Milan empty, the center of, these big centers in Seoul and, Beijing that are just empty. And so I think that was the thing I was sort of trying to evoke in this movement was a lot of empty. The feeling of feeling empty.
Yeah. No, I totally get that. I mean, I just love that because it's obviously the timbres themselves are really are very cool, but like you don't stop there. You're not just like, oh yeah, sandpaper block is cool. You actually turn it into just this kind of like static. I don't know, that just decorates every sound around it.
Yeah, like creates this whole atmosphere instantly. Like you're just in this new world with all of this ambient sound that is just a part of this world. It's so cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, really quickly, Chris. So then, what's the difference between this movement and the next one, where you said you are kind of starting in Sibelius, it's running through the same samples, but you're notating rhythms in measures?
Yeah,
right?
Let me see if I can kind of. I'm gonna pull it open and show you guys.
Cool. Yeah.
I got a text saying turn on original sound, but I think my sounds are pretty original. But I think hopefully it sounds okay. It's on original sound.
It is on.
So
okay.
hopefully it's coming across clearly. So I've kind of jerry-rigged Sibelius to play back sounds in Logic, which is quite annoying and difficult to do. But it is doable. So you'll see the score, and it looks like a jumble. Let me see if I can get it to work on my end before I put it on your end. Okay, Sandbox Project 2. Really good file name. So it's working on... Okay, let me make sure it works here. So I think... Hold on, just 1 second. Okay, so if I do this, it works on my end. And... Okay, that's good. So then I will screen share my sort of hilarious looking... You'll see why it looks so bad as I get this going. And, okay, screen share, Sibelius, share computer sound. So you see this file, and it looks like a disaster, doesn't it? Okay.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know if that note is... I don't know if that note's in the vibraphone range.
This is my Akio homage, actually. But, okay, can you just tell me if you hear a sound?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
you heard a lot. Yeah, so this movement, the goal of this movement was just to be as different as humanly possible from that movement. And so this movement is, I basically build a sampler, and it plays back, this is my piano sampler. It says gongs, but it's a piano. But it plays back all sorts of different just samples I have. So the chord is up here, you have these... That's just the piano with those muted notes that I showed before. And then I've got a kick drum as a sample. So this chord that looks like a cluster is just a kick drum, a hi-hat sample, a snare drum, a guiro, very high woodblock, and then a bass drum, and then some those low notes I showed before. And so you'll kind of see how, when I compose this way, it's really, I'm plugging the sounds into Sibelius, but I'm playing them back through Logic, and you can kind of follow along as you go. But this is my fiance partner, Carrie. I played this for her, and she's like, "It's awesome. It sounds like the construction site going on outside our house." Because there's been a huge building going, and you hear all these kind of hammering away rhythms, and they're all polyrhythms, and different. So this is about 3 minutes of music. You'll hear the first sections, high notes from the piano playing a lot of rhythmic sounds that are all very muted, and then you'll hear very low notes, and the group kind of joins in one by one.
And this was the next movement from what you just played?
Yeah, this is coming straight out of where we just were. So that kind of build-up of rhythmic sounds, and suddenly you get... It's really construction site sounding. This is those low piano sounds plus bass drum. So I just call this the rite of spring part. And finally, the first time in the movement, there's a little bit of pitch used from the vibraphone. And now it's vibraphone and en bloc and double together. So that's the first section of the third movement.
Damn.
Super cool.
Yeah.
It's so funny. You were talking about knowing our musical tastes, and I think you can clearly see all four of us kind of jamming along over here.
Yeah, this is the first time I think. Well, we heard a snippet of this before, but this is the first time we heard that whole excerpt like that.
Yeah, it's a little bit of percussionist porn, I think.
Well, so Chris, right before all the shelter in place stuff started, we had the opportunity to work on this movement a little bit in the studio, and it was cool because you pretty much had the whole thing written. Like what we were working on was the exact orchestration of that percussive hit that keeps happening throughout the movement. And so Chris had me get out like a whole bunch of instruments. We had bass drums and kick drums and snare drums and tom-toms and woodblocks and guiros, everything. And then he and I together, we tried to see how many things we could play at once. And then we just played this hit over and over again until we found what combination did we come up with that we liked?
I think it was a muted, like a floor tom, actually not a bass drum, with a mute on it with a towel over it.
Right.
And then a snare drum with the same thing with a towel on it. And then a kick drum, I think, too.
Muted as well, I think.
Muted, and a hi-hat muted. And then on top of that, eventually there would be one piccolo woodblock, which is that kind of dotted eighth rhythm on top of it.
Yeah.
And I think that was kind of the main setup of that whole part. And then we're sort of figuring this out. I talked to Connor a lot about this, too, is just that how loud we can get those hammered out piano sounds. And so we'll sort of figure out how that works. But the idea is that sound is supposed to evolve too, and you actually get one of my favorite composers is Lachenmann, actually, and he has this amazing piece actually called Kinderspiel, or Child's Play, and at the last moment of the piece is just all repeating the top two notes of the piano, and what happens in that piece actually is a kind of acoustic phenomenon of different overtones kind of bouncing around the piano when you repeat those kinds of notes over and over again. So that's kind of my homage to that part of the piece. And I think can't quite hear it in MIDI, but in real life you can hear this kind of like sound that changes with the repetitions.
Yeah,
awesome.
no. Well, the thing you just mentioned about the piano sound and trying to figure out how we can make it louder or not, that was something that we talked about with the percussion sounds. Because obviously we're really worried that if four of us are like slamming on these drums and these woodblocks and all this stuff, that we're going to overpower Connor.
Exactly.
But so we tried. You and I tried it a few times with us, just with the percussion, just not playing that loud. And that didn't work because we weren't able to get the sound quality. In the MIDI, there's this amazing quality of this intensity of the strike
Yeah.
of the percussion instrument. So that's where all this muting came in. We were just like throwing towels and tape on everything. Even the wood blocks, we put like layers of tape on a wood block.
Oh yeah, that was so cool.
You know?
Yeah, well, because I think the thing is, you're basically muting the piano, so you need to mute the percussion too. It makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's you would notice how the timbre of the instruments change with dynamic.
Oh yeah. So you need a forte dynamic that's held back. I mean, I think you said that you played Martin Bresnik pieces that do this as well.
Yeah, he loves to do this thing with drums where you put a towel on them and then just pound them so that, like, as loud as you can, but the resulting sound has no ring at all. It's very, very dry, and it's very, very muted.
Yeah, that's really cool. There's one more section of the piece. You guys want to hear it? It's about 2 minutes.
Absolutely.
This one's part in Logic too, but I want to show you. It actually starts exactly where we left off in the piece, and it now features your favorite instrument. So the whole idea of that section is I mean, it's funny because you guys like, is it a piano concerto? I think it's a piano concerto, but I think it's a piano concerto in the vein of a Bach piano concerto, where the piano's at the core of the piece, but it's not like long showing off parts, but rather is that he's playing in every moment of the piece, and I think he's sort of musically leading the piece, if that makes sense.
I feel like it's similar to your percussion concerto, where you say the percussion is the core of the sound, but the orchestra is the resonance around it, and everything. Maybe how we are.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's because I think kind of inherently, like, a lot of kind of romantic concerti are kind of dumb, because they're just, you know, I mean, I'm more interested in kind of, I mean, there is like almost like a political act of concertos where the person is working with the group rather than fighting the group. I feel like this romantic idea of concerto is the concerto against the orchestra. I'm like, no, we need to work together. There's a pandemic. Like, everyone has to work together. But, you know, we can feature someone. There's still a president, the prime minister of the piece. Let me screen share one more time. So this next section picks up right where we left off, and you'll see that one of my big inspirations for this piece is a piece by Grisey called, well, I'm not going to say what it is, but it's 4 Songs for Crossing the Threshold in English. And it's his last piece, and one of the genius things he does is he uses, instead of having interludes, he has these kind of just like quiet rubbing on the drums that just kind of functions as this kind of pause. And so little by little, the pause in the piece, as you heard at the beginning of the second movement I played you, which is just quite quiet and sort of rubbing, turns into rhythm. And so I think a big part of this piece is that those initial things turn into rhythm. And this is where I try to bring that element of the piece together with other elements of the piece. And I'll sort of just, so there's, now it's like 4 to 5 layers of people playing Sandbox. And you can hear the same rhythm from the piano is now in the, can you hear that? That's the same rhythmic pulse. But you'll see that I build on top of that all these layers. And now the other thing about this part is that whole first part of the piece was all about muted piano with the pedal down, so you get all the resonance. Whereas now it's all about the muted piano with the pedal up, so you get all sorts of dry sounds. And so you'll also hear the big part of this is a credit card scraping along the low strings. Very rhythmic, kind of, violent sound. And then this kind of like thud of just those same low notes you were hearing before, but with no pedal down. And so I'll show you this also. And the one other sound, which is, I figured out this is from my flute writing life, is now coming to my percussion writing life. But I do this sound with the harmonica where you have to stick your tongue right into the hole, and no one laugh because it's very obviously funny. So you go like this. And it creates this kind of amazing, like, envelope. And so you'll see how these parts all operate in this piece. And this section's about 2 minutes long, maybe 2.5. Now you hear the harmonica coming. Doubled with a bow vibe. And finally, you'll hear the piano playing again right here. I think this sounds like popcorn. Inside to get pitch again. And there's arm glocking, vibes, and the same detuned piano. So yeah, that's the jam that goes back right into the part you just heard with the, it's basically just this eighth note triplet thing elaborated on over and over and over. It's a layer after layer or layer of this kind of simple rhythms piled on top of each other. And so that'll kind of go back into the material you already heard.
I mean, I'm just struck by the same thing I was saying before. It's like instantly you throw us into this world. Like if you close your eyes while you're listening to that, the world that you have around you is gone, and you're just in this new atmosphere entirely. It's such a cool thing.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this one. I mean, I feel very teed up to succeed on this project. Like a bunch of musicians I love working with, doing kind of the thing I do well, which is percussion and piano, and working with people who are really eager in game and good sports. I mean, it's kind of amazing. Just like we composers are like little babies, and we need constant praise to keep going, or at least encouragement. And so I think that a good collaborator, someone who's like so excited, like you guys saying you're excited to hear this is so thrilling to me, and makes me want to go back and work for another 50 hours on it, and just feeling like I'm in good hands, it inspires you to do your best work, and so I think when collaborating with composers, just the sheer enthusiasm goes such a long way, and
Dude, we are so excited.
Yeah, that's so cool.
It sounds awesome.
Yeah, it sounds really cool.
Are you guys impressed with my playing there? By the way, that's all me playing Sandbox.
All right.
Oh no! Now you're gonna give us so much grief about our Sandbox playing.
I mean, the rhythms will be a bit more accurate when you guys do it, but that's all me playing on it.
There's this one part in Goldbeater Skin, for the person who was asking us about Goldbeater Skin, where we have to play these really, really fast Hocketed 16th notes on Sandbox.
With like one hand, right?
With one hand. Well, because you're doing other stuff with the other hand, and for me, at least, that was like the hardest thing in the entire piece. I think I was always kind of driving the struggle bus a little bit with that section.
You're playing offhand though, right?
I did switch at the very end. We realized that not the only reason I sucked at Sandbox, like I also just suck at Sandbox, but one of the reasons was because I'm a lefty and I was playing with my right hand. So I think I reorchestrated my setup or whatever so that I could play with the left hand eventually, which helped a lot.
Haven't you had to play a ton of Sandbox stuff for that new Viet Quang piece as well?
The piece called Sandbox, yes.
It's like all sandpaper, yeah.
We're a little bit better, I think. I think we're better rhythmically at Sandblock playing.
We're getting better.
Definitely leveled up. I think we're ready for this new challenge.
It's like a weird composer fetish to be into Sandblocks, honestly. I don't know why. They're so cool. Like
we should commission Todd to write Sandblock etudes.
Ah.
You should. Oh my god, that'd be amazing.
We were sort of, I don't know, we were feeling this way when we were learning Viet's piece, but actually Sandblocks and Sandpaper is a ridiculously expressive sound. It has all this, kind of unique direction. You can take the sound in all these different ways, like increasing tension and decreasing tension, all just kind of with this one instrument. It's actually really versatile, which is cool.
Not what you expected when you first
Right.
thought about sandpaper. I mean, with his
Yeah.
piece, it's not even sand blocks. It's literally just a piece of sandpaper that you're holding and rubbing on a surface.
Well, there's a great moment in that. Do you guys know that piece "Circles" by Luciano Berio?
Mm.
Oh yeah.
There's that great moment where she's just like saying an S, and it transitions into a sand block, and it's an amazing moment.
Yeah.
And that was the
Wow.
first time I was like, "What is that?" And so then,
Wow.
ever
Chris,
since,
can I ask you a question? I'm just curious what the process is now to take this Logic file and get it on paper, like in a way that we can understand. Like how long is that process? Is that very fast, or is that super tedious? I'm just curious for myself.
It's definitely tedious. Having that kind of, at least the Sibelius framework helped a lot. When I do work in Sibelius, I think that I got an approximate running count of who's doing what in that MIDI file.
Cool.
There is going to be a couple of, because Ian and I basically sat down a few weeks ago. We were all supposed to sit down, and then legally it wasn't a good idea, and you guys were just coming off possible contagion, which thankfully everyone seems like they're okay now. So the goal was just, we were gonna all meet, and so just, but I think I have a mental tally going of who's doing what, and then I kind of, some of it still remains to be TBD, but I basically know how many hands I have, like how many layers I can write, and that, yeah, that's a process. But we may come up against some unexpected things in the interim. It's like you don't write 1,000 lines, but I basically wrote 8 lines, and I knew I had 8 hands from the percussionist and 2 more from. So there's basically 10 lines going at any time.
That's interesting that you did it in that order, because I feel like there are other moments, certainly in Goldbeater's Skin, where I would imagine you kind of did it in the other order. Like you knew that like one person's on marimba, one's on vibe, whatever. You kind of laid those out and then maybe added additional accessories as you could. But it's interesting that this way you're like, no, I need all these sounds, so I'm writing all those sounds, and we'll just figure out how to orchestrate them later.
Yeah, I'm definitely thinking that it may involve some kind of contraption for the beer bottles where you have to have them strapped around your neck the way you have the harmonicas, but that is to be determined for another day.
Yeah, we were practicing this thing where I was blowing into a beer bottle and also bowing like a single note on the vibraphone, which was possible, but I felt like I was like hunched over and I was kind of hyperventilating a little bit. It was a little bit of a thing.
Yeah, and I think something else Ian and I talked about was space in the piece. So it's like technically that second movement could be done on one vibraphone with 4 people on it. But we thought maybe we'd use 2 to spread the melody across the space, sort of like left, center, like left vibe, piano, and then vibe right. And that, so it was almost like the idea, it's like if some school wanted to do it or some group of students who didn't have 2 vibes could do it on the original setup. But I think a lot of this stuff is, unfortunately, it's a terrible thing about this time, and, besides all the death and carnage and apocalypse, is that we can't hang out and work on it. And so I'm hoping that, hopefully we'll be let up at least a little bit in, a month or 2 and can work together.
Well, that's a great segue. Let's talk about what's next for this piece. So, it is a little bit up in the air with everything that's happening, but our game plan right now, we're supposed to premiere at Caramore on June 25th, but before then, we actually have this week of a residency at this amazing facility out in Jersey City called Mana Contemporary. I think actually some of the folks from Mana might be tuning in right now, so if you are, hello. They have been so generous to us. They're going to allow the 6 of us, the 5 performers and Chris, to kind of live in this theater that they have. And Chris will be done with the piece at that point. We'll have kind of learned our parts, but that'll be our moment to play everything for Chris and together kind of take it from that first draft that he's created into the performance version.
Yeah, I really, I'm praying that at least at that point, if the world hasn't completely come back to normal, that, maybe there'll be some lessening of the restrictions and, maybe in New York specifically. So we can only hope and pray that will be the case.
6 of us can congregate at least.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can just remember from the other projects that we've done with you, but like that moment of where you take the things that you've imagined in your head or done in Logic and actually hearing them on the instruments, I feel like instantly you start changing little things here and there. Once totally. You finally hear them.
With the 2 of us together, so I can only imagine what the 6 of us together will be like.
Yeah. Well,
Chris, there's a couple questions actually in the YouTube chat.
Okay.
A quick one actually from Nick Hall, who's another composer. he was asking if you've heard the Requiem for a Dream soundtrack.
It's Clint.
And so,
Yeah, Chris Mansell. I have heard it. I think did David Lang do the arrangements on that?
Oh, did he?
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
I think he arranged the string quartet parts. I have, and I can't place it off the top of my head, but I'm sure that it's. I'm sure the world is not dissimilar.
Yeah, that's cool. And then we had another one actually just now, which is about the sandpaper blocks. Is when you play with the sandpaper, is the grit prescribed? And do they pitch differently?
I do not prescribe. I don't really think there's much of a discernible pitch.
Yeah.
Well, there's like a relative pitch. Like the bigger the grit, the lower, I guess you would call it, the resulting sound is.
There certainly is a difference, though. Like the fine sandpaper versus the more coarse sandpaper.
Yeah, I don't actually like these. I bought these at my corner hardware store, which I don't like because they're too like. I don't know. I think they're a little harsh sounding. Maybe they don't sound that way to you guys.
I mean, the other thing that,
Yeah,
that we've noticed both in Gold Beater and in this new piece that we were just talking about with a lot of sandpaper is that they wear down very quickly if you play them a lot. You have to kind of replace the Yeah,
we were actually for Viet's piece. We were changing the sandpaper before every performance. So like fresh sandpaper for every performance.
Yeah, I think that would probably be a good idea. I think that the sound should be very. I mean, I think I haven't used Sandbox as much rhythmically recently, but yeah, I think that probably the projection will be the biggest thing. So I'm guessing that you guys will probably want to use some just really sharp, fresh sandpaper that can just cut because it's not the loudest sound in general.
I feel like that is something that you do really well when you're working with folks like us. Like you try not to prescribe things that are not necessarily in your wheelhouse. Like I don't think you'd write to me and be like, you must use this sandpaper unless you tried it and thought it was a good one to use. But
no,
rather
you would and ask you what one you think would be the correct one to use.
Well, that
or
what you just did, like you describe the sound that you're looking for, and then it's kind of our job to like try all of the different sound, all the sandpapers until we find the one that gives the sound that you want.
Yeah, totally. I think that my one experience with people playing my music is they opt for the mallets that are just a little too hard, and I'm always telling them to kind of go down a notch. And that, especially with orchestral players, their tendency, right, logically so, is to project, and so I'm much more to blend. And so, like a lot of the times, I find myself kind of going up to them and being like, "What are you using? Okay, now go 2 notches softer," and yeah.
Yeah, I think, and I'm always reminded of this whenever I'm talking to a composer about music, but it really helps me access that kind of creative part of my brain where sometimes if I'm learning a piece and it's on marimba, I just feel like, oh, it's a marimba piece, it's supposed to sound like a marimba, the audience is going to hear a marimba, like, period. But listening to you talk about your music and just how much attention you pay to the sound, and I think it's not just for percussionists, it's for every musician, to think about like transcending the instrument a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's always my goal to sort of denature instruments, is to sort of be like, is to really try to, I remember it's like every time you hear an orchestral hit, it's the same hit. It's like the cultural memory of the boom, is there for you forever. And so I guess for me, I'm always trying to start out a piece of being like, oh, like let's erase that memory and create new memories of sounds. And so I think, yeah, I don't want to. Like marimba, we've all heard it, And so I think for me, my initial tendency is to be like, I don't want you to think about those things when you hear this. I want you to think about something else.
Yeah, that's awesome. It makes me think of one of my favorite moments in Gold Beater Skin is actually the first entrance of the voice. So the guitars have sort of started their half notes, and then Ian and I come in with the voice with a Onglaken marimba, or maybe it's just Onglaken vibraphone voice combination, and it's like Johnny was sort of saying at the beginning of the talk, is it's just this one sound, and Ian and I's job is just to kind of like try to put it right inside the voice sound, and it's not Onglaken sound, and it's not just the vibraphone sound, but it really is this sort of conglomerate thing.
Yeah, and I think it's like, and you look back as far as Mozart and his operas, and you see this happening. And so I think I'm always like, I always think of myself as a dramatic composer, in as much as that there's always a drama inherent in the sound, and I think it's always like it's like almost a characterization. It's like, it's like you don't have, it's like it's what someone's wearing. It's like sort of the orchestration is like that. It's like, who is this character in the piece?
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for spending
so
this time with us.
We're like, we'll do 30 minutes, and now we've done an hour and a half.
Yeah, if people want to find out more about Chris, he's at ChristopherCerrone.com. If there's anything that we could recommend to start checking out, he released an album this past year that was nominated for a Grammy, an amazing album. So I would recommend checking that out first.
Sounds like a good start.
Yeah. And I guess we just want to thank you all for hanging with us during this time, especially to Jay and Helen for helping to make this piece happen, to Kathy for helping to put on the piece, and fingers crossed that we're going to be able to do that, and to Mana Contemporary for doing the workshop.
Available that they're hanging on to.
Yeah, now's the time.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. We'll be back. I think we'll be back next Sunday. We'll keep you guys posted.
Monday.
Or maybe Monday. That's true. We'll keep you guys posted about that. But thanks for hanging out with us, and stay safe.
Thanks again, Chris.
Thanks.
Yeah,
guys.
thanks, Chris.
Thanks,
I'm really
Chris.
looking forward to it.